Hi class, welcome to our discussion of adolescence. We're going to introduce adolescent socio-emotional development by talking about Erikson and his sense that identity versus role confusion is the key psychosocial crisis of adolescence. But first, let's think about this. Can you see how, in a sense, adolescence is the toddler stage of adulthood? Let's think about that. Toddlers and adolescents both are undergoing rapid changes in physical development. All of a sudden, that little toddler can stand up, hang onto the toilet, and throw a toothbrush right in that toilet and see what happens. They're starting to be able to crawl, they can walk. This is newfound freedom for them, right? As they're able to get away from mom and dad's arms and go explore the world. Well, teenagers are undergoing a lot of physical development too, are they not? Think about those long, gangly arms and legs. Think about, oh my gosh, I've suddenly got breasts. Think about, I've got body hair where I never had it before. These are huge changes in their physical development. Their center of gravity changes, lots and lots of changes in physical development for both toddlers and adolescents. Rapid changes in verbal dexterity. What are toddlers doing? Well, they're learning to talk. They're saying their first words by age 1, by age 2 or 3, they're starting to do telegraphic speech. By age 3, they've got a few thousand words. What are the adolescents doing? Well, thanks to their newfound cognitive abilities, in terms of formal operational thought, think Piaget right there, they're able to do things like hypotheticals. They're able to think abstractly. They get very argumentative. They see everything in black and white. So they become much more able to express themselves verbally. Toddlers and adolescents are also both learning to be independent. That toddler is trying everything out on her own. She's moving farther and farther away from mom, from her secure base. So are teenagers. They're working part-time jobs. They're staying out till midnight. They're responsible for their own schoolwork. And both of them are pushing the limits until parents say no in order to protect them, right? Your little toddler is going to go in the kitchen and start pulling out all those pots and pans until mom says no. Your teenager, well, she's probably going to roll her eyes or groan or sass you until you put the limit in place and say no. So toddlers and adolescents have a lot in common. So this sets the stage for us to think about development in adolescence from an Eriksonian standpoint. For Erikson, let's think back through Erikson's stages of psychosocial development. First of all, you have trust versus mistrust in infancy. Then you have autonomy versus shame and doubt, initiative versus guilt, industry versus inferiority in childhood. And finally, you get to identity. Identity versus role confusion is the psychosocial crisis in adolescence. Well, what is identity? It's a consistent definition of oneself as a unique individual in terms of roles, attitudes, beliefs, and aspirations. Here he is, Dr. Erikson himself. And so he calls it identity achievement versus identity or role confusion. And he says that what the adolescent is trying to do is they're balancing between selecting a single self and trying out many possible selves. We all have a lot of possible selves. For an adolescent, this is going to be things like, am I going to be an athlete? Am I going to be in band? Am I going to be a goth today? So they are trying on all of these possible selves. I remember as an adolescent, freshman year of high school, I tried out for the cheerleading team. And I made it, and I spent a year on the cheerleading squad, but it just was never quite me. It never really felt good. So I tried music, and I played piano for a couple of years, and I could do it, but it was hard. And finally, I tried tennis, and that clicked. Everything was easy. It came easy to me. It was something that really felt good. And so as I'm going through all of those things, I'm developing my identity. Cheerleader, no. Not really a music person. Athlete, yes. Okay? So that's what kids are trying to do. My son is working this out right now. He got a black leather jacket recently. He's in 6th grade. Middle school, 11 years old. Got himself a black leather jacket, which he has wanted so badly for a year or two. And so first day of school, he is dying to wear this jacket to school. But here in Texas, it's 105 degrees on the first day of school, so I encouraged him not to do that. Finally this week, it's October, we finally get into the 60s in the morning, and he is dying to wear that thing. So he wears it, and he comes home, and I say, "Hey, bud, how'd the black leather jacket go over in school today?" And he said, "Oh, it was great. They were like, 'Oh, you look like a biker, man.'" So he's at this very beginning process of trying on a possible self. What would it be like if I were a biker guy, if I rode a dirt bike? That's what he's kind of working out. And as parents, we just let our kids do these things, you know? If they're basically a good kid, getting good grades, not doing drugs, and they come home with blue hair, that might be the time for the wise parent to say, "You know, I'm going to let the blue hair go. This is my kid trying on possible selves." So for Erikson, remember he is working in the latter half of the 1900s. So we're talking 50s, 60s, and 70s. Was life different then? Was the cultural zeitgeist different then than it is here in the early 2000s? Absolutely it was. So there are ways in which his theory, although it is applicable today, the timing may be a little off. For him, he's thinking of identity versus role confusion really being done by about age 18 to 20, right in there, that you have figured out your religious identity, what you believe in terms of God and religion. You've figured out your gender identity, your political and ethnic identity, your vocational identity. Would we say that most 18 to 20-year-olds have all this stuff nailed here in 2016? No. No, most people don't. This kind of thing has gotten pushed back. Maybe people have this done by about age 25 or so. Of course, this varies person to person. So we talked a little bit about religious identity. What did he mean by gender identity? Well, what he meant and what we think today in 2016 are probably different things. For him, gender identity was simply, for an adolescent girl, what does it mean to be a woman? What is a woman's roles? How can I become a woman, and how will being a woman affect who I think I am? Same thing for an adolescent boy. What does it mean to be a man? What kind of roles do men play? How can I become a man? Of course, today we think of these things, and we also think of issues of transgenderism, and we also think of issues such as sexual orientation. Political and ethnic identity, he was imagining that by and this was true for him back then, that by 18 to 20 years old, you had a sense of where you stood politically. You knew if you were liberal or conservative, Republican, Libertarian, Democrat, what have you. And then finally, vocational identity, deciding on what your career and vocation will be. So you can see that these things are still at play today, and yet they probably are happening later than they were in Erikson's time. So for Erikson, identity versus role confusion is the psychosocial crisis of adolescence. He's thinking this is pretty much done by age 20. And when he was researching and writing, by age 20, you were heading toward marriage. Average age of marriage would have been about 22 for men and about 20 for women. Today, that looks more like 28 for men and 22 for women. So he's imagining your identity is done by about age 20, and then what's the next thing that you do in life? Well, for him then, the next step was marriage and intimate relationships. And so he said, look, if the adolescent hasn't figured out who they are yet, if they end up in role confusion, that really interferes with the ability to move into the next stage of forming intimate relationships. We should think about how this is all taking place in the adolescent's brain in terms of their cognitive development. What is happening cognitively for the adolescent? Well, they have hit formal operational thought. They are able to think abstractly and hypothetically. What this implies is that they're now able to sort of fantasize, think about various roles and do these trial runs, like my son trying on the biker jacket, like me trying out cheerleading and tennis and piano. So kids are fantasizing about these roles. They're thinking about their talents. They're thinking about romance, friendships, religion, politics, gender orientation, what kind of roles they're going to take in society. One of the cool things about identity versus role confusion is that we have this theory by James Marcia. It's actually not Marcia, Marcia, it's James Marcia, and his work on identity state. He said, look, this is a fascinating theory of Erikson's, but let's operationalize this so that we can test it in the lab. And so he started looking at identity, and he's thinking about it in terms of two dimensions, crisis and commitment. And from these two dimensions, crisis and commitment, he gets 4 identity states. Remember, we've talked about Diana Baumrinn's theory of parenting style, right? She also had 2 dimensions, control or demandingness and warmth. And from there, she got 4 parenting styles. Well, here we have a similar thing, crisis and commitment leading to 4 different identity states. Now, crisis here, I got to tell you, crisis here does not mean what you and I typically think of as crisis. This is not, something really bad has happened, a snake is in the house, or something like that. It is, crisis in Marcia's model means that you are wrestling with your identity. You're thinking about it, working through it, actively exploring, okay? So let's look at each of the statuses. Achievement, crisis leading to commitment. There was a crisis, you did explore, the adolescent actively explored alternatives, and they have made a commitment to a particular identity. Foreclosure is commitment without crisis. The person is committed to an identity, but never actively explored. This is premature identity formation. Oftentimes, this is the adolescent adopting parents' or society's roles and values wholesale without questioning. So imagine a kid whose dad is a doctor and he grows up always thinking he's going to be a doctor, and so he commits to being a doctor and he's never really explored anything else. That's an example of foreclosure. Moratorium is crisis is actively present. The person is actively exploring options and has not yet made a commitment. This is a good status to be in if you are, say, 18 years old, to be actively searching and trying to figure it out. And finally, you have diffusion, where there is no commitment and no crisis. The adolescent doesn't seem to know or care what his or her identity is. They're not actively exploring and they're not committed. Achievement tends to be obtained at different times for different aspects of identity. So for example, you could imagine an 18-year-old or a 19-year-old who's spent a year in college and taken some different classes and has now decided, yep, I'm all set, I'm going to be a chemistry teacher. But they maybe haven't really thought about religious identity, maybe really haven't thought about political identity. Maybe they're still working through what does it mean to be a man. Okay, so you can be in different identity states for different aspects of your identity. Identity achievement is likeliest when parents actively encourage autonomous exploration of alternatives. They're trying to get their kid to look at a bunch of different things, trying to encourage the kid to head toward commitment. And this is best facilitated by parents who have the time and resources to help the kid explore alternatives. Kids who are living in poverty don't have access to this nearly as much. Now finally, the last point I want to make about this is that moratorium and achievement are more common in young adults than in adolescents, and diffusion and foreclosure is more typical of adolescents, especially early adolescents. You can imagine a 13 or a 14-year-old definitely being in diffusion or foreclosure in terms of, say, politics or religion, but by the time they're 18, 20, 25, they may be actively wrestling with this or have come to their own conclusions. All right, I'm going to put on Blackboard a handout for you that gives 4 vignettes, and you're going to have a chance to read those 4 vignettes and try to decide which identity state each of the adolescents is in: diffusion, moratorium, foreclosure, and achievement.